actually, in Nigeria, a journalist that we all respect and love. So, okay, I'm waiting for, can you, if you could come forward, I would really appreciate it, so that people don't disrupt this event. This is a very important event to me. I will not be the sausage or anybody. Thank you. Those people having that beautiful conversation, just come two rows forward. Just come, please. Get this event going now so that we'll be done. We have exactly 1 hour. Then you can have dinner, relax a bit, and then we all go to Jevenik in a bit of an exodus. For those of you who are wondering where it is, very easy to find. Once you come out of the hotel gate, you are on Isaac John. You just turn left. Make sure you're wearing this. If you have your lanyard, you won't have any problems. It's free for you to watch. If you don't have your lanyard, you'll have to pay. So we only have 100 seats, so if you have tickets, if you know people who might want to come and watch it, let us know. They can buy a ticket at the venue. But otherwise, it's easy. Make sure you get something to eat. It's a long play. It's 2 hours plus. So we'll be there till late. I'm just preparing you. So if you want to grab a bottle of water, do so. Okay. So without further ado, I am going to invite my brother, one of my biggest cheerleaders. He calls me often. He supports me. Sometimes I really don't know what I would do without him. But he calls me just to find out how I am, just to find out how preparations are going. And I really appreciate that. Please join me in welcoming this veteran journalist, author of Jailed for Life, somebody who's very important, not only to me, but to the Nigerian story, Kunle Ajibade. I thought he was going to draw attention to the belly fat I've developed over these few days. So I quickly did this. All right. So, and I'm now going to invite our headliner, our special guest. It's taken us 4 years to get you here, but we got you here in the end, and we're so very proud to have you. Anyone who's read Nuruddin Farah will understand where I'm coming from here. I mean, he is such an important author for us on this continent. And it gives me great joy to present today Mr. Nuruddin Farah.
Good evening, everyone. Nuruddin Farah is a distinguished professor of literature at the Bard College, upstate New York. Because he's a highly gifted and hard-working novelist and playwright, He has been, in recent times, a perennial nominee for the Nobel Prize in Literature, just like Ngugi wa Thiong'o and Haruki Murakami. He has won other major international prizes, apart from Nostad's International Prize for Literature. Born 73 years ago in Baidoa and Somalia, his father was a merchant and a translator for colonial masters, while his mother was a poet. He had his primary and secondary education in Somalia and Ethiopia. He then went to Punjab University in India, where he studied philosophy and literature, and later to the University of Sussex in the UK, where he studied playwriting. It was in Punjab University where he wrote his first novel, From a Crooked Rib, which was published in 1970. Since then, he has published many other novels, short stories, several plays, screenplays, and essays. His new novel, North of Dawn, will be out December 4 this year. His novels have been translated into more than 20 languages. Medina, one of Nuruddin Farah's strong female characters, an editor and a translator, says in Sardines, and I quote her, "Good writing is like a bomb. It explodes in the face of the reader." I don't know how much of that writing credo Nuruddin Farah believes in, but he has been exploding in our faces all these years of peace and war on our continent and in the world with his sophisticated voice and analytical brilliance. He places truth at the center of fiction and fiction at the center of truth. There's a great deal of anguish in his fiction, but there's also a great deal of tenderness. Farah knows how to write about women. And so the voices of women in his novels are so eloquent. If Islam permits us, we may want to fall in love with many of his great women. He also knows how to capture so well the tension between the strong and the vulnerable. To Nuruddin Farah, when a country loses its way in a cloud of smoke, only writers with wonderfully crafted arguments, deep insights, provocative, devastating, transformative stories can redeem that country. He has proved that in From a Crooked Rib, A Naked Needle, Sweet and Sour Milk, Sardines, Closed Sesame, Maps, Gifts, Secrets, Links, Knots, Crossbones, Hiding in Plain Sight, and North of Dawn. When, as a journalist, I was trying to make sense of the history of Somalia that had collapsed into stateless anarchy, the fiction of Nuruddin Farah made it a lot easier for me. So Nuruddin, I thank you so much for that. Please join me informally welcoming our guest, Nuruddin Farah, to Lagos, to Ake, and to this conversation. You're welcome, sir.
Thank you very much, and good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Is this live?
Yes. Your narrator in Links says that friends are forever linked through the chains of the stories they share. We're all friends now, so let's share stories. So what kind of childhood did you have? What professions were you interested in as a child? Was creative writing one of them? Can you recall the values you were raised with?
Well, I had a very interesting childhood, protected by my mother, because I was the only child that she gave birth to. She gave birth to 11 children, and I was the only one of the family that looked like her family. So I had a very special place in her heart. And because I had a very special place in her heart, I was often protected from the wrath, my father's wrath, because my father had temper. I think because I was introduced to the written tradition early on in my life, at the age of 4, I was sent to a proper school because my mother was pregnant with another child. She couldn't cope with me, a very demanding, anxious child. And I had, at the same time, in the same space, 2 traditions that supplemented one another. One was the oral tradition. As I said, my mother was an oral poet. And the other one was the written tradition. And by the time I reached the age of 8, 9, I was expected to read, write in, and speak 3 foreign languages. And that is Arabic, because I was born a Muslim, Amharic, which is the official language in Ethiopia because I was going to school in Ethiopia, and English. And it was my being introduced to some of these languages that I began to show interest, not so much in writing, but in the fact that the world was unfair. The world was unfair to women. The world was unfair to children. And it is an often told story that when I was 9 years of age, because my father wouldn't give me enough pocket money, I set up some kind of letter writing office. I had no office, but I had, I would sit in front of the post office, and adults my father's age or older, men and women, would come and they would tell me their stories. And then they would tell me what language they wanted the letter to be written in. At this time, I'm, 9, 10. And I remember one particular day, an old man came, and he wanted a letter written to his wife, who, despite promising many times that she would get back, did not do so. So the man said to me to write in the letter, he said, tell her to come back, and to come back quickly, in less than a month, because if she does not come back, I will go to the town where she is, 350 kilometers away. I will beat her up, break every bone, and drag her all the way to the home which she has deserted. Now, instead of writing what he told me, I wrote, if you do not come back inside a month, you may consider yourself divorced. Whereupon she went, because he used to beat her every time, he was very cruel to her. She took the letter as evidence, with the assistance of her older brother, sought help from the qadi, from the judge in the town, and she was divorced. 6 months later, the man, having lost patience, went to the village, and he discovered that she had gotten married to somebody else. And when he inquired, he was told that the letter said that she was entitled to being divorced. He came back, reported me to my father. I was punished and asked never ever to write another letter. By which I mean that the unfairness was clear to me from early age. It was clear to me that my father, who was always very sweet to other people, was not as sweet to my mother or to his daughters. And I always felt that there was something lacking, something absent from the relationships, husband and wife, or relationships, father and daughter. And that is when the idea came to me that one way or the other, one must deal with these social injustices for society to become developed, healthy, and forward-moving. So that's, I think, when the first anything that I did right that began to make sense.
That was in primary school?
I was 9, 10, yes.
All right.
Yes.
So before you left for Punjab University in India, this is your secondary school stage now, or phase in your life. Did you engage in any creative writing outside of
letter writing?
Letter writing leading to divorce. Has any of these early writings survived? And what do you think of those early writings?
I don't know if they survived. What I can tell you is that my first 2 short stories, in fact, instead of making me happy with what I felt I had achieved, created anxiety in me. And the reason is, my second short story was translated into Greek. My first short story was translated into Italian and Arabic. And I became self-conscious and began to doubt my ability to write the kind of books that would be translated into English and other languages. And then on top of that, I wrote 2 novels before From a Crooked Rib, neither of which were ever published. And till this day, I have no idea where they were. I know for a fact that one of them is in the basement of a publishing house in America, because the editor wanted to publish it, but I was anxious and too arrogant to revise anything. And therefore, I don't know what happened to it. And the first novel, From a Crooked Rib, when I first submitted it to a publishing house, to the publishing house Hahnemann African Writers Series, the editor wrote to me a letter in which he asked me the question about my gender. Are you a man or a woman? Are you Mr. Farah or Miss Farah or Mrs. Farah? And I hesitated whether to communicate my gender, because if I did communicate my gender, I thought he would not publish it. So I kept very quiet about it. Until this day, I receive letters addressed to Mrs. Farah. When I was married, I used to give it to my former wife, but now I'm not married, and so I don't know what to do with them.
So what would you consider as the best learning process for you at that time? This was at a stage when you were about to enter, the university, right?
No, I was in my second year university. I was about 21, and I was always not interested in taking exams or studying. I was more interested in writing. And so I wrote a novel to avoid reading for an exam.
So how did you pass your papers?
Well, they failed me at first. And then, since my teachers knew my class participation, because in class I was very good, or at least this is what people thought, I was given the second opportunity to sit for the same exams as the other students, and then I was allowed to pass. And even in the end, because almost every year I wrote the draft of one novel, and therefore in the 3-4 years that I was at university, I must have written about 3 novels, and that's what my life was like. And even today, for example, I mean, it's my habit. I live in Cape Town, and quite often work from about 9 in the morning until 5 in the afternoon, thinking about writing or doing the writing. And the reason is because I've dedicated my life to the thought of writing, to the thought of developing and learning the writing, and so on and so forth.
So what sort of books did you read, at that time? And did those writers influence your writing?
Well, I'm quite sure they must have. I mean, they're not obviously they're not obvious in the books when you read them, but they did influence me. And one book that I think, one play rather, that I think influenced me greatly is A Doll's House.
Okay, that's Chekhov.
Ibsen, in which a woman who is miserable in her marriage walks off the stage saying to her husband to go to hell. And I thought, and I found that very interesting. And I thought that many a woman married to a cruel husband should be able to walk away and say to them to go to hell.
You also talk about Hemingway, Dostoevsky.
Yes, well, yes, well, you know, I mean, I suppose when you are a young writer and you want to impress your readers or your literary critics, you mention the names of big names. And, you know, we mentioned Dostoevsky, we mentioned Shoyinka, we mentioned Echebe, we mentioned all these people, but I doubted very much if they had much influence. Okay. And the reason is because, you know, writing is like tilling the grounds for a farm, preparing the earth to bear fruit. And unless you copy from something, inspiration usually comes through hard work and through sitting down and writing daily and revising it. And every novel that I write, I must revise it at least 5 times.
You're right. You are very critical of Al-Shabaab and all forms of religious bigotry in North, Crossbones, and North of Dawn. That's your latest novel. Was there any religious fundamentalism and jihadism in Somalia when you were growing up? Who is to blame for religious madness and excesses in Somalia now? And how can the world get a respite from the Al-Shabaabs, the ISIS, the Boko Harams of this world, and the Taliban terrorists who killed Basra Farah, your younger sister, in 2014?
Well, Somalia was known for being a secular nation. We were all secularist, never religious. In our homes, in the way we prayed, society was modest in its expression of the faith. But after the collapse of the state structures of Somalia in 1991, as it happens 2 years after that, I would actually arrive in Nigeria, married to a Nigerian woman who has since left me for better pastures.
That's Aminat's mama.
Amina, yeah.
And your first wife, Shitra. I
Yes.
don't know why you are not mentioning their names.
I may be asked to pay tax. Yes, and so when Somalia collapsed in 1991, was about to collapse, I was actually in Uganda teaching at Makerere. I was just talking about it to someone sitting here. And I tried to somehow bring peace between the warring parties and negotiated with the opposition groups and tried to get the government and the opposition groups to come and meet in Kampala, where I was living at the time. And then after several attempts of talking to President Museveni, who's still in power in Uganda, I was rather impatient with the slow pace of the peace efforts that Museveni and I were involved in. And then the BBC at one point asked me, what's happening, Mr. Farah, to Somalia? Why isn't somebody doing about it when it's collapsing? And then I said, stupidly, of course, still a young man, I suppose, I said, because Museveni was more interested in appearing on the world stage, moving from Kampala to New York to Baghdad and back to Kampala, thinking that he would be able to stop the American juggernaut of war from attacking Saddam Hussein. And at which point, Museveni threatened me with detention, and I had to leave in the middle of the night and leave my car, my apartment, and blocks of books with friends of mine to sell when I was gone. So I'm used to being thrown out of countries. It's a normal thing in Africa. And then I came to Nigeria when we had the displeasure of living under the dictatorship of Sani Abacha. But by then I had written 3 or 4 books on dictatorship. So my interest has always been on social justice, on democracy, on the fight against all forms of tyranny, however small or however big.
I spoke just now about the killing of
My sister.
Pastor. How did that affect you?
Well, it did affect me quite a lot. It did affect me quite a lot. My sister was a nutritionist working in Afghanistan for UNICEF. And then she rang me a couple of days earlier. And then one day she went to a restaurant having lunch because she would be coming away to America, and she and I were supposed to meet because she was an American citizen, my sister was. And then 11 Taliban terrorists went into the restaurant where she was having a meal with some of her friends who had come to say goodbye to her because she would be leaving for America. And she died in the attack. Now, I would learn from this when someone from the American embassy in Kabul telephoned me at 3 o'clock in the morning in Cape Town and learned about it. Now, at that very time, during that week or month, I had submitted a new novel in which someone who works for the United Nations was killed by, terrorist attack in Mogadishu. And since what happened to my sister was exactly the same sort of thing that had happened to this man the character who was killed in the book, I withdrew the book from publication, or at least I tried to withdraw the book from publication, because the story, I felt guilty, and I said I had willed my sister's death, that I had written about someone exactly like her, and that had happened to my sister. And that book became the novel that's now available here, that's being sold, Hiding in Plain Sight. And so sometimes a writer's fiction could turn into truth. And that is why we say that fiction is never, good fiction, in inverted commas, is never far from the truth. It tells, a version of truth.
So who is to blame for religious madness and excesses
Some groups of Arabs would not like it.
Okay.
But it would be very hard for you to find a rich petro-Arab dollar country being attacked by terrorists. The terrorists, this is my version. I have no, I can't tell you, I can't share my thoughts with you about it in an evidentiary sort of way and say to you, these are the facts. But it's my feeling that the Arabs pay some of these terrorists monthly stipends to keep them away from their countries and keep them in Muslim areas where they fight and kill their own people or other people of other faiths. Number one. Number two, mention the countries that are suffering greatly from terrorism, Islamic terrorism. And these are Afghanistan, which is not an Arab country, Somalia, Boko Haram of Nigeria, and a number of other Muslim nations. And they kill more Muslims than they kill Christians. And they specialize in terrorizing poor people, while the Arabs who pay them their monthly stipends have a comfortable existence wherever they are. Now, this is the kind of distorted faith that enables some of these people to create havoc in the lives of these people. And regardless of how you look at it, Islamic terrorism causes the deaths of more Muslims than anyone else.
That's right.
Than anyone else. And therefore, Europeans complaining about Islamic terrorism or, that doesn't work very well. The theory that they are to take over the world. They're not going to take over the world. What they want to do is to destroy the faith so that they could take over the areas of the world in which they could propagate this distorted faith. Who is to blame? Who is to blame? Society is to blame, because people who are educated, who are employed, who are serving their country well, would not listen to these terrorists. It's usually the underemployed, the lumpen proletariat, who usually fall victim to their machinations. And that, I think, is very important. And the reason is because they cannot convince someone like me to join them, knowing, of course, that they're not telling the truth about Islam. They're not telling the truth about Islam. Yeah.
What truth about Islam are they not telling?
Well, they are insisting that the only way of worshipping Islam is to go back to the 13th century Islam. Number one, that's number one. Number two, they insist that if they kill any number of people and then they die, they go straight to heaven. They're not going to heaven. They're going to hell. I can tell them. Because if you kill one person, one innocent person, you cannot present yourself to God, to Allah, to say, that you're a good Muslim. And any one person who has killed one person, they can't expect anything but hell, all forms of hell.
Thank you for that. There is a verse of the Quran. Of course, you memorized the entire Quran when you were young.
When I was young, yes, but lots of
Have
Shakespeare and other things have come in between.
You've forgotten all those verses?
Yeah.
I thought you were going to just, give me a verse to support these truths.
Well, I speak Arabic well enough. I speak Arabic well enough that I could actually fool you into...
No. La hikiraha fi din qad tabayyana rushdu min al-ghayy. Isn't that a verse of the Quran? That there should be no compulsion.
That sounds like some Afghani talk.
So why did your first novel, From a Crooked Rib, which is a critique actually of patriarchy and misogyny, brought you instant love and fame among your compatriots? And your second novel, A Naked Needle, brought you hatred from Siad Barre's government. Just let me help you.
We're in Nigeria. That's all right. It will dry.
We treat our guests nicely in Nigeria. Yeah. Okay.
Yes, go ahead. Sorry.
Yes. Your first novel, From a Crooked Rib, brought you instant fame and love from your compatriots. As a matter of fact, there were so many women friends you made as a result of that novel. That's your confession. And your second novel, A Naked Needle, brought you hatred from the Siad Barre government. Why?
Well, let me tell you in actual fact how it happened. When I published From a Crooked Rib, which talks, which dates, well, I wrote it in 1968 and was published in 1970. And this is before feminism. And therefore, we didn't have words. Patriarchy was not in constant circulation. You didn't use words like that. But I was interested in the nature of subjugation, of the male gender dominating the life and soul of women. So having written From a Crooked Rib, which is sympathetic to the woes and tribulations of women, I then wrote another novel. My second novel is called The Naked Needle, which is about a misogynist, a self-hating, women-hating character. And my problem with A Naked Needle was that it became the Bible of misogynists, which is the total opposite to my initial intentions. And I pleaded with my publishers once I discovered that the book had become a Bible for the misogynists. I pleaded with my publishers to take it out of print. And the editor wrote to me a letter in which he said they had never received a letter from an author saying, I want this book taken out of print. Because usually people say, I want my book to be reprinted and reprinted and reprinted. And then we agreed that it would be allowed to sell and there will be no second reprint, no second printing, which pleased me entirely because I could not face the thought of having written a book for misogynists. And now if you want to buy A Naked Needle, you will have to pay $750 for one copy. Only very rich misogynists can afford. I thought I was talking actually about art, about writing, about sophisticated writing, and so on and so forth. But it was twisted. There were very few people who saw what I was trying to do. And therefore, I think I failed in my attempt to write a book which was successful on the surface, but structurally weak. And it was structurally weak because the entire novel is based on one chapter from Ulysses by James Joyce. And I thought I was a clever young man. You see, I'm at the age of 27, 28 when I wrote it. But I've regretted writing that book.
Was there any attempt to censor the book?
Well, I also ran into trouble with the state. And I was given 30 years in prison if I returned to Somalia. And because I didn't, at the time I was 29 when I was sentenced to 30 years, and I thought if I went into prison, I would never be able to write another novel, misogynist or not. So I decided, voluntary exile.
Now, for 22 years, you couldn't return to Somalia after that.
Because by then I was sentenced to death. First, it was 30 years. First, it was 30 years for a novel called The Naked Needle. And then I was sentenced to death for a novel called Sweet and Sour Milk. And then I thought, well, there is nothing left.
So you went into exile?
So I went into exile and continued writing. And I usually say I have said this to young African writers, that if you live in the same household as your mother or your older brother, you may not be able to do much writing. But if you go away from their domination and go somewhere else where nobody knows you and work very, very hard daily, you may be able to do excellent writing. Because distance, in other words, exile, allows you the possibility of seeing things from a distance and therefore evaluating things for what they are. Whereas if I were in Somalia and I was writing the kind of books I was writing, my mother, my older brother, my father, somebody would always say to me, "We love you, but you are stupid, risking your life." But the only thing that happened immediately to the members of my family was that 8 of my brothers and sisters lost their jobs. They couldn't work for the state, so they had to find other means of, they became freelance and so on and so forth.
Would you say that writing about imaginary homelands is more creatively pleasing and rewarding?
Well, it is, because what you do is there is a Somali folktale, which is one of my favorite folktales. There is a man, a traveler. I think there was a session I attended earlier today talking about traveling. This particular traveler travels and travels and travels, and then comes to a road with 2 forks. And he knows that if he follows one fork of the road, he will go east. If he follows the other one, he'll go west. And he knows that he doesn't have the time to do both journeys. And yet he wants to be able to do it. So what he does is he imagines folding up one of the forks of the road and wearing that as a belt, and walks on the fork of the road in front of him, and walks and walks and walks until he comes to the end of it. And then he unfolds the one that is around his belt. That does sound Yoruba, doesn't it? Folktale.
It's not just Somali.
It's not just Somali.
Yes.
Yes. Well, there you are.
Thank you. In Sweet and Sour Milk, when General Siad Barre murdered all the Muslim clerics who were critical to him, Soyan, that fantastic character who worked in the presidency, went to him and accused the president of violating the Constitution. The president was surprised that Soyan did not know that he had become the Constitution itself. Not long after that, Soyan died, having been poisoned by the KGB operatives. In view of your criticism of Siad Barre and other dictators in Africa, you just mentioned Abacha now, but I think you wanted to say Ibrahim Babangida. How did you survive your tormentors? Would you say that the dictatorship you criticize so much retarded the growth of Africa in a lot of ways? Is it not difficult or hopeful for the future, given the mess that Africa and some parts of the world are making liberal democracy now?
Well, let me say this in a very simple way, the way I see dictatorship. I don't see dictatorship or a dictator as someone who comes out of the blue and for whom we are unprepared. I usually see very many mini dictators in very many households in Nigeria, in Somalia, in Africa, and in most other places. And it's because we tolerate the tyrant, the father who is tyrant, or the mother who is the matriarch and a tyrant. we enable these tyrants in every household to invest their authority in the dictator supreme. In other words, you wouldn't find, Siad Barre would not have existed if it hadn't been for the fact that my father was also there terrorizing the family. If Babangida, if there weren't many other Nigerian husbands who were treating their wives badly, their children badly, and so on and so forth, in many households, there would be no Babangida. Because this is a hierarchy, and the hierarchy leads to the president. We only see the president because we all suffer from the president. Whereas if Mr. X, and I'm not pointing my finger at any man, have you noticed I'm pointing at the door, lest I am accused of actually saying terrible things about any one person. If we did not have these small tyrants in every household, there wouldn't be. Do you see?
Yeah. In our offices too.
Exactly. You see, when Siad Barre was very unhappy, the dictator was very unhappy with me. One of the things he did was he called my father. And he said to him, you know, I offered him. Well, you're being given a message. Have you seen it? Okay. Yeah, we've seen it.
That's dictatorship. That's Lola's tyranny.
Lola would become a matriarch. So this is my point. My point is there is no, that we shouldn't look for, for other explanations. In the same way as if you're thinking about the Civil War, people usually think that civil wars happen to only, a few countries. They don't, because what happens is there are civil wars continuously within the household. I'm a novelist, and therefore I could say to you that to describe a civil war, you just take a man and a wife, a small unit, the two of them quarrel, and they quarrel, and they quarrel, and then eventually one of them, the husband or the wife, would go to a third party and say, you know what, I'm having problems. The third party would say, I always know that man was a stupid man. What did you find in him? Why did you marry him? Leave him. The man would go to another friend or a relative, would tell the story, and then they would say, she's not worth much. Divorce her, get rid of her. So what civil wars happen is it brings in more and more people, brings them into the private life. And that is what civil war is. There were 12 countries that were involved in the Somali Civil War. 5 Arab nations, America, England, and so on and so forth. And when the Nigerian Civil War occurred, do you remember how many, how arms were being sold to this group and that group? And that's what happens. Since we have very short time, we have to move faster.
Finally, before I open the floor to questions and comments, this question: an 18-year-old aspiring writer, Atish Tasia, once visited the late V.S. Naipaul with his journalist mother the excited Tasia told Naipaul that he just got an admission letter from Ames College in the US. Don't go. Naipaul told the young man. What should he do? Tasia's journalist mother asked. Naipaul paused for effect and then said, go out boldly into the world, find out for yourself what the world is like. What would you, Nuruddin Farah, what would you have said to that young aspiring writer?
I would have said the opposite to whatever Naipaul has said.
Thank you very much, Nuruddin Farah. Thank you for this stimulating session. Thank you so much. Thank you. Very quickly, can we take questions and comments from the audience? How many? 2 questions. Oh, wow. A man and a woman. The man in cap, blue cap, yeah. Right?
Yes, I'm a little bit curious when Nuruddin Farah mentioned that he was so apprehensive reading books to write. I could recollect that in an interview with Achebe somewhere, a student asked him in the classroom that he wants to become like him. And Achebe replied that if you want to write, read. So my curiosity is over what you said about yourself in the earlier years, that you didn't like to read, but you want to be writing. So my curiosity that...
No, he didn't say
I understand what he said. My curiosity is that can you become a good writer just through practice? Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, but he didn't say that.
Thank you. This is wonderful. So, Mr. Farah, you mentioned with The Naked Needle that you asked your publishers to take it out of print because it had become a misogynist Bible. How much responsibility do you think a writer has or should take for the way his or her work is perceived or received?
Thank you very much.
I don't think much. I don't think, it's a matter of interpretation. But one of the reasons why I took the book out of print was because I was unhappy about the book becoming, the Bible for misogynists. And every time I moved anywhere, especially in West Africa, men beating their wives, being cruel to their girlfriends, would always tell me how much they enjoyed reading that novel. And therefore I thought I don't want to be responsible in part to the terrible things that, people do to others. But maybe now I wouldn't. Maybe now I would say, And as for the gentleman who, well, if Achebe said anything and everything, Achebe was a wiser man than I am. And therefore, we would leave it at that. And I did not say that you mustn't read. You can only do the writing. I repeat, the first book that you write could actually be natural, something that comes out of you. And I'm generalizing here. The first book could be something that comes from your own experience. but I have written 15, 16 novels. They couldn't all come from my experience. So what you need to do is from the second book on, you must continue doing research. And by research, I mean read and read a lot. Read until you become a different person in comparison to other people. And my newest novel, the novel that's coming out in a couple of months, it took me 2 years of research to be able to write the novel that I have written. Obviously, it's not always evident that one has done the research. But you must read, and then if you read excellent books, you are likely to write good books. I'm saying you read excellent books, you can only write good books. So that means that reading would contribute something to your well-being. And 24 hours a day, what would I do by myself? I live alone in a house. I can talk to ghosts for about, 5-10 minutes. After that, what do? I mean, I have to read.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Nuruddin Farah. Thank you. And thank you so much also for being a good audience. Thank you.
And we would like to say a very big thank you to you for the amazing job that you've got done today. And I think Mr. Nuruddin Farah deserves an Ake special applause. Please be upstanding.
My only worry is that I'll get used to this, you see. And then
Thank you very much, sir. Thank you. The group photo, very well. A photo, the two of you. Thank you. So, just a tiny bit of housekeeping.